One of the major components that are very important when it comes to risk management is managing personnel and personnel security. Any business that operates has an influx of hires and fires or onboarding and offboarding of employees. So managing that security is really, really important, okay? Internal personnel are the closest ones to critical data. They're the ones that are custodians of the information, users of the information, and so on. So it's they're the ones that need to understand, well, actually not need to, but do understand the controls that are in place. They're aware of what those controls are. They're aware of the flaws or the weaknesses. That's why inside facilitator attacks are pretty prevalent, right? If somebody wants to rob a bank, it means that somebody outside of the bank may not be aware of all of the different security mechanisms in place to protect the assets of the bank. But a bank manager or a teller might have much more visibility of that and can provide that information to an attacker so that they can exploit those vulnerabilities. So in order to ensure the integrity of information and assets, you want to implement something called segregation of duties. That's the whole basic concept. It takes two people to turn the keys to launch a nuclear missile type of deal, right? So one person doesn't have complete control. You need to make sure that their job descriptions are identified and documented correctly. And by the way, the access privileges and rights that a user has to systems should be based on those job descriptions. We call that RBAC, rules-based or role-based access control. Mandatory vacations. It's an interesting concept. I've actually seen this implemented in a few different environments, banks specifically, where they require their employees to take a vacation. What would be the purpose of that? The purpose of that would be to ensure that when somebody else comes in and takes over that job function, they can identify anomalies in documentation, anomalies in operations and procedures, etc. So somebody might be maybe writing themselves checks or providing a backdoor access to a system that they're not supposed to have. By forcing a mandatory vacation, you're obviously need to still fulfill the role of that employee that's on vacation, so somebody else can come in and fulfill that role. And in that process, they have visibility of what the previous employee was doing in the organization. Job rotation does kind of the same thing in that it requires a new individual to come in and perform the same function, but it's a little bit different than vacation because the previous employee is still doing a job, they're just in a different position. Least privilege access, very important as well. When you're onboarding employees, you make sure you need to define that employee's job responsibilities. Make sure you do whatever appropriate reference checks, whether they're financial or psychological or legal checks on an individual. Background checks, defining confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. Especially if you have an employee dealing with a lot of intellectual property, it's important to define those non-disclosure agreements. You have to have specifically defined termination policies as well, right? Not only because you want to protect yourself against wrongful termination lawsuits, but you also want to protect the data that the employee is responsible for. So whatever access that employee had to that information, that access needs to be revoked in some way, and we need to be able to ensure that we're preventing that employee from being able to access that information at another time. So you have to have specific termination policies. Job classification is really important because you can define the rules and the roles that individual has based on those job classifications. Trying to mitigate and limit the amount of harm that an individual can cause through the misuse of systems, disclosure of information. If I just have an open door policy for specific types of information in my organization, then it's a lot more difficult to ensure the integrity of that information and to make sure that it's not actually being disclosed. Let's see, what else? Data processing disruption, modification, etc. Role-based access is required, and jobs with access to sensitive data may require strict policies and clearances. All of this is related to every bullet point that we previously talked about on this slide, right? Role-based access means need to know least privilege, job rotation, implementing segregation of duties, etc., and so on. So very, very important. Different types of checks that you can perform, investigations. You can do reference checks, look at somebody's past work history, their competencies, how do they work with teams, what are their leadership skills, and so on. Reference checks basically are character checks of an individual. Individuals may claim to have a lot of knowledge or understanding of certain things to get a job. That doesn't mean they're necessarily qualified. So you can't just assume that that individual is ethical and being truthful about their work history or whatever. Background investigations are important as well. You know, make sure that salaries, duties, certifications, degrees, educations, credit history, all of that stuff is accurate. We had a customer, a company that owned a golf course, and the CFO for that golf course was hired and handling millions of dollars in transactions based on his degree, which was supposed to be in business administration and finance. And it turned out eventually the guy was arrested for skimming money off the top and embezzling money from the organization. But it turned out that he was operating under a false name, number one, and secondarily, he had no degree at all in any of those areas that he was supposed to be responsible for. That's part of that whole concept of due diligence that we talked about previously. It's the responsibility of the organization to ensure that the appropriate steps are taken to ensure the individuals that you're hiring. Okay? So background checks can help mitigate risk, making sure that you have qualified hires, you know, reduce your turnover because the individuals are far more qualified than say, somebody not actually qualified and so on, okay? Different types of background checks would apply to different types of verticals, right? In the healthcare industry, you want to make sure that you want to hire individuals that don't necessarily have any serious medical problems or things that can be transmitted to patients or whatever it might be. The financial industry, you want to make sure you're hiring an individual that hasn't been convicted of financial crimes or fraud. A lot of times, and you guys are very aware of this, when you get your clearance, you know, they're going to check your financial background, they're going to check your personal background, if you have any big-time secrets, you know, anything that can be utilized against you to persuade you to divulge information through the use of coercion or whatever. And so there's reasons for checking all these things. Okay? Credit checks, criminal history, driving history, drug and substance testing, prior employment. I'm not going to read all these bullet points. I think they all make sense. These are all considerations when you're performing your investigation or check on personnel that you're bringing into your organization. Once the individual is brought into the organization, it's important that they understand what their responsibilities and roles are within that organization. So you have to have employee agreements and policies in place. And I'm not just talking about things like, here's your vacation policy and here's your sick leave policy. We're talking about policies of enforcement, particularly pertaining to the environment of security, right? This is how you're supposed to handle data. When you're accessing this system, this is how you're supposed to access the system. You are responsible for this data, and you need to make sure it remains secure. So that's one aspect. A very common example of that would be an AUP, an acceptable use policy utilizing network resources within an organization. Non-disclosure agreements can be used as well to protect company intellectual property, a code of conduct, identifying conflict of interest. Gifting policies, very, very important. When I worked at JPL, we often had contractors coming in trying to get contracts in business. We couldn't even accept a pen from them. Something that you would seem relatively benign could be construed as generating conflict of interest or, you know, quid pro quo, where I'm getting a pen, so I'm not supposed to give you $1 million contract. But a lot of organizations, rather than defining the thresholds for the gifting policy, they just simply say, yeah, you can't do it, right? You're not allowed to do it. Performance and compliance reviews, of course, need to be conducted against your employees. A variety of policies and agreements and processes are considered based on best practice. And again, not everything applies to everybody. So policies and procedures and guidelines that you might have in place for one business might not necessarily be a good fit for another type of business. So it's very important that you define what that is for all lines of business. Okay? The goal is to allow the employees functionality while minimizing their susceptibility to either accidental or unintentional misuse, or coerced misuse, or just blatant misuse. So that's the general goal of personnel security. So one of the things that we can do is job rotation. That reduces the risk of collusion when working with sensitive information or systems, and also provides backup coverage. So that applies to your disaster recovery planning and your business continuity planning. Job rotation is really important. I was one of the shows that I saw, American Greed, was a controller for a small city. Controller is basically the person that handles financial transactions for the city government, etc. She was basically the sole person responsible for writing checks to vendors and accepting checks from vendors for services rendered and so on. As such, she had complete control of how that money was handled. And it turned out she nearly bankrupted the city because she stole over $65 million over a span of 10 years or so by embezzling the money, because she was the one. Nobody else had that responsibility, and had somebody else had that responsibility, it would have been caught in just everyday function, right? Because the transactions would look fishy or whatever. That's eventually how she got caught. Right? The city just decided to do an audit, a regular audit, not because of any suspicion, and all of the red flags went up at that point. So separation of duties, meaning don't give one person the keys to the kingdom. Make sure you split duties across multiple individuals, so that reduces errors, that reduces fraud, and introduces checks and balances. Your network management team is different from your server management team, is different from your security team, and so on. Now that adds complexity to the overall, goal of implementing security, but it also compartmentalizes the impact in case a breach occurs. Least privilege, need to know, mandatory vacations, we talked about those already. Okay? Not only, when we're talking about personnel, not only do we have to deal with the personnel that we're hiring or firing, we also have to deal with external vendors, contractors, and consultants. So pretty straightforward. Make sure you monitor the visitors, make sure that they sign non-disclosure agreements, identify how they gain access to the facility, how you can verify that access, escort those visitors. Permanent visitors, we might perform a background investigation. A contractor that's there on a regular basis, you know, you might want to do more due diligence by investigating that individual more specifically, right? In any event, anyone with access to sensitive information has to be screened, and they have to sign contracts that specify their requirements and obligations as well. Believe it or not, that contract part is probably not followed that much. Yes, visitors come in, they get badged in, they have to provide identification and so on, and then in turn they get escorted through the facility or whatever. But I don't know, I haven't seen it too often when I've gone into customer sites where I've actually had to sign a document that states that I'm not going to do certain things. Now that might be part of the scope of work that you define for the client, an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that you would sign or execute with that individual organization or whatever. So there's these documents or contracts that you can sign that have long-term impacts on that relationship, but I very rarely see that on a temporary basis. All right, so personnel security, again, something to consider when you're dealing with security and risk management. And that concludes this particular lesson.